It's great to see you this morning. Look forward to this time studying together from the Word of God. We are in Luke. We're studying through the Gospel of Luke, and we're in chapter 6. Luke chapter 6. As we've studied in Luke chapter 6, we've recognized the very close parallel to Matthew's account of the Sermon on the Mount. And we're right at the end of that, and you'll recognize again that Luke's accounting very similar to Matthew's accounting right here at the end of this presentation. So let's pick up our reading in Luke chapter 6 at verse 46. Why call ye me Lord, Lord, and do not the things which I say? Whosoever cometh to me and heareth my sayings and doeth them, I will show you to whom he is like. He is like a man which built a house and digged deep and laid foundation on a rock. And when the flood arose, the stream beat vehemently upon that house, and could not shake it, for it was founded upon the rock. But he that heareth and doeth not is like a man that without a foundation built an house upon the earth, against which the stream did beat vehemently, and immediately it fell, and the ruin of that house was great. We recognize that last part. Our kids in the Bible classes sing about the wise man built his house upon a rock, and you remember all the hand gestures they use. The foolish man built his house upon the sand. It's a child's story, or a child's song rather, but it is a very essential point, and we'll talk about it here. I actually like verse 46 almost just as a standalone verse. And so many people in our world need to come to grips with a principle set forth there. Why do you call me Lord and you don't do the things that I say? The word Lord actually suggests that he is a position of authority and mastery. If you call him Lord, you're saying, I acknowledge you as my authority figure. I acknowledge you as the one who has the right to tell me what to do. That's what Lord means. And he says, why do you do it? Why do you call me that? And then you don't do what I tell you to do. That's a completely contradictory thing, to call him Lord and then not obey his instructions. But we know, and we are just surrounded by people on a day-by-day basis. We're surrounded by people who would say, yes, I believe in the Lord Jesus Christ. But they don't do anything. They don't do anything at all. We're not talking about whether they're doing their religious activities accurately or not. We're not even talking about that. We're just talking about they don't do anything at all. Did you notice, as you were driving here this morning, did you notice that the traffic on the roads was way less than a typical morning at this time of morning? I mean, there was no traffic on the road. Why? Because these people who call Jesus Lord are sleeping in today. They're doing other things. Now, they'll get up here in a little while and they'll have some breakfast, and then they might engage in some recreational activities. It's not a real pretty day to go to the lake or play golf, but they'll do something else. They'll certainly watch their football games this afternoon, but they call him Lord, but they don't do anything about that. They call him Lord, but they don't even make any effort at all to do his will. That's just a completely self-contradictory concept. Tom?
Because John says, if you love me, you keep my commandments.
They say they love him.
Yeah, but they don't. They look at these commandments. That one doesn't really apply to me.
Yeah.
So it's on that same basis that's going through. That love and calling Lord sort of equated terms in the way that it's used in both passages.
Exactly right. Exactly right. All right. Now, obviously, I think you see the link between that statement and concept with the very familiar build your house upon a rock, build your house upon the sand. The wise man is the man that builds his house on a rock. So I think a lot of you have, at various points in life, probably gone through some kind of a building project, maybe had a house built or something like that. And you know that it is essential to dig down and lay a good foundation. You wouldn't think about just starting to frame up your house right on the ground. You wouldn't do that because you know that's not stable. That's going to erode away. Your house is going to crack and fall down. Matthew's account talks about it. It probably emphasizes even more. Matthew's account says the foolish man built his house on the sand. Sand would be even worse than dirt because sand's not stable at all. It's going to go away. Many of us have been at various times on the beach, and maybe you try to build a little sand castle on the beach, and then the tide comes up and the waves hit it, and she's gone. And Matthew says that's the foolish man built his house on the sand. Here Luke's account says he just built his house upon the earth. But we know that would just be ridiculously foolish. And he says that if you hear what he says and don't do what he says, it is that foolish. Now get that. He's saying you are as foolish to hear and know what's expected of you and not do it. You are as foolish as a person who would just build his house without a foundation. On the other hand, of course, the opposite of that, if you hear and do, you are like a wise man. You are like the one who understands that you have to be built upon a firm foundation. Jesus, rightfully so, is acknowledged as the master teacher. And I've always believed that the reason why we would ascribe him that title is because of statements like this. You can see that, can't you? That's just so easy to grasp. You don't have to have any help getting that picture and understanding that principle. Jesus certainly taught a lesson there that nobody can miss. The little kids, when they sing their song, they get it. They understand it. But as we said earlier, it's certainly a principle we need to apply. Tom, yes?
I'm reminded of these verses, when I'm watching the news or weather or something other, that the hurricane has washed away some of the coast and these big, beautiful houses go right down into the ocean.
Yeah.
And they build right back up there.
On the sand.
On the sand.
Yeah, we hear a lot about the hurricanes and the devastation. But I'm going to tell you, if you build a house right out there on the beach and the hurricane comes, don't be surprised if the house gets knocked down. The reason we hear about so much more damage with the hurricanes is we got a lot more people building their houses on the sand at the beach. But it is, like you said, those videos we see really graphically illustrate this. Tom?
Jesus uses this analogy with rock and the apostles as well many times. Like over in we're in Matthew, we talk about upon this rock I'll build my church. A lot of people think it's Peter, but he's talking about the confession that Peter made. And then you read in other places where it talks about the stone that the builders rejected became the chief corner. Those building things in that foundation is important to be laid.
Oh, and people have known that for centuries, right?
And Jesus makes that, teaching in a very elementary teachings. This thing. And we look at that with, with people who become Christian saints. If they don't get a good, solid foundation built, the chances of them wavering and, falling away are, substantially more than, getting that good, solid foundation.
And that's why it's so important that we are well grounded in the foundational doctrines of the Word of God, because a lot of places are not even emphasizing that at all. But it's really important to have that foundation. I think you're right. Anybody else? Timothy?
Whenever you set your principles in life, that's kind of where you need to look, right? I mean, you talk about foundation. Well, foundation is going to be a key influencer to how you make your decisions. So whenever a catastrophic event happens in your life, and don't worry, it will, you got to have a way to set what you're going to do.
Yeah.
And those foundational principles are going to be how you establish the actions that you take.
And I think that's a good point, that if I haven't got those foundational principles already in mind, and then the devastation, because as you say, every life is afflicted with various crises. But if I don't have my foundation and the crisis comes, it's too late to make the foundation when the crisis comes. I need to have it already in place so I'm ready when the crisis comes. I think you're exactly right. All right. Okay, good. That's good observations. A very important text there for sure. So that sort of concludes Luke's accounting of the Sermon on the Mount presentation. So we begin in chapter 7, verse 1. Now when he had ended all his sayings in the audience of the people, he entered into Capernaum, and a certain centurion's servant who was dear unto him was sick and ready to die. And when he heard of Jesus, he sent to him the elders of the Jews, beseeching him that he would come and heal his servant. And when they came to Jesus, they besought him instantly, saying that he was worthy for whom he should do this. For he loveth our nation, and he hath built us a synagogue. Then Jesus went with them, and when he was now not far from the house, the centurion sent friends to him, saying unto him, Lord, trouble not thyself, for I am not worthy that thou shouldest enter under my roof. Wherefore, neither thought I myself worthy to come unto thee, but say a word, and my servant shall be healed. For I also am a man set under authority, having under me soldiers. And I say unto one, Go, and he goeth, to another, Come, and he cometh, and to my servant, Do this, and he doeth it. When Jesus heard these things, he marveled at him, and turned about, and said unto the people that followed him, I say unto you, I have not found so great faith, no, not in Israel. And they that were sent, returning to the house, found the servant whole that had been sick. All right, so I think we all recognize the centurion. Obviously, that's a Roman army officer. A centurion would have been an officer over a band of 100 men. And so he's I don't know, Wade, you've been in the Army. Would he be a captain if he's over 100 men? Probably like a captain in our Army. So he's this ranking, pretty high ranking, not highest ranking, but a relatively high ranking Roman Army officer. Let me ask you a question. Was he a Jew or a Gentile? Hey, Tom?
The indication he's a Gentile.
Yeah.
Because he sent the Jewish leaders.
Yeah.
He didn't go himself. And it's interesting that here, as a Gentile, he had a good relationship with the Jews. Normally,
He loved their nation, it says.
normally they would ostracize him.
Yeah.
Only deal with him where they had to.
Yeah.
It looks like it was a lot closer relationship.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's almost certain he was a Gentile, although it doesn't say so, does it? But there's several indications that he would be. As Tom said, he didn't come to Jesus directly. He sent others. He said, "I'm not worthy." Verse 7, I didn't feel worthy to come to you myself. Jesus makes the statement, I have not, at the end of verse 9, I have not found so great faith, no, not in Israel. Now, someone could quibble about that and say, he's just saying, I've been all over Israel. I've never found anybody has as much faith as this guy had. And I suppose it could be interpreted that way, but I think he's contrasting. Here's this Gentile man, and I haven't found that kind of faith among the Jews. So I would argue just pretty adamantly that this guy was a Gentile, although someone could quibble and say you couldn't prove it without fail, and maybe not. It doesn't say he was Gentile, but I think all indications are that he was. James.
Matthew's account begins at times and then talk about others from all different directions and nations will come and see the family of Abraham, Isaac. So it seems he makes a distinction there that this is
Other nations.
Other nations like this man will be part of the table, the feasting of in the end. So it seems like he was more
Yeah, I think so. All right, so he has this servant who is sick, and he already has the kind of faith that Jesus could heal this sick servant. So the elders of the Jews, it wasn't just a few of the common people, but actually the elders of the city of Capernaum come and they come to Jesus and besought him or begged him or urged him because he says this. They said, this man is worthy. He loves our nation. He has built us a synagogue. And as Tom pointed out, this would not be typical of a Roman army officer. There was a strong animosity between the Romans and the Jews, for sure. The Jews resented, the Romans were occupying their land. I mean, that's the kind of terminology we would use. The Romans were an occupying force, and the Jews didn't like that. And the Romans were pretty oppressive toward those that they ruled over. And so typically this would not have been an endearing relationship between this Roman army officer and the Jewish people of the city of Capernaum. But in this case, this is an outlier. This is an exception. In this case, there was a good relationship. He loves our nation. He has built us a synagogue. Of course, a synagogue in a town like Capernaum would have been a place where the Jews would meet on the Sabbath day, and they would read the scriptures and study. Obviously, if you're going to make sacrifices, you go to Jerusalem to the temple. And the Jews were required to go there on a somewhat regular basis. But on a given week, on a given Sabbath, you'd go to the local synagogue, and that's where you would assemble together with other Jews, and the scriptures would be read and commented upon. And he has built them a meeting place. It wouldn't be fair to say, but we would say he built them a church building. It wasn't a church building, but he built them a place to assemble for these purposes. Wade?
Another thing that this suggests is that Jesus' fame was just limited to the Jews. His fame is starting to go out to all people, because just like you say, this was a Roman.
Yeah.
He wasn't a Jew. And so he's hearing these things. And for a Roman to be able to go, bring this guy to my house, I think that says a lot, because most of they would have probably been like, he's an officer in the army, he commands a lot of people, you don't just go grab somebody, because that could influence somebody to go against you.
This might not look too good on your record. You've been sort of fraternizing with these Jews, but he did anyway. Good point.
Can you imagine what he said after Jesus healed his daughter?
Yeah.
Could he have told his friends and say, "Listen"?
I don't know. Yeah, he could say, "I don't know what you think, but that guy is special," right? Okay, so Jesus went. So when the elders of the Jews came and besought Jesus to heal the officer's servant, Jesus went with them, verse 6. But before he could get to the house, he wasn't far from the house, not far from the house, it says in verse 6, the centurion sent more messengers, saying, "Trouble not thyself, for I am not worthy that thou shouldest enter under my roof." That makes you think that he was even familiar with Jewish regulations concerning associating with Gentile people. And, I don't know, a proud man would have said, "Listen, you think you're too good to come to my house? I'll tell you who's too good. I don't want anything to do with you. You think you're that good? That you won't even darken the door of my house? Forget you." That's what a proud man would have said. This man is entirely humble, and he understands the kind of regulations that the Jews have about this open association with Gentile people, I think. Don't trouble yourself. I'm not worthy that you should come under my roof. He said, he says, I'm not worthy that thou should come under my roof. Wherefore neither thought I myself worthy to come unto thee. That's why messengers have come, verse 7. Because I didn't even think I was worthy to come personally or directly to you. But, he says, say a word, my servant shall be healed. He has the kind of faith that I trust that you don't have to be in the presence of my servant. I believe that if you would just say a word remotely, that my servant would be healed. And then he makes a comparison that just really impresses Jesus. He says, I know what it's like to be in authority. He says, I'm an officer. I have authority. I say to one soldier, go and do that, and he goes. And I tell another, come, and he comes. And I tell my servant, do this, and he does it. I know what it's like, he says, to be able to command and expect response, to command and get the thing done. Because when I say so, it gets done. My soldiers and my servants do what I tell them to do. I know what that's like. And he says, I believe, basically saying to Jesus, I believe you have that kind of authority over physical illness. That if you just say a word, just like I can command my soldiers, you can command physical illness. And if you will just say a word, my servant will be healed. And that just, I think in our vernacular, we would say that just blew Jesus away. He was blown away by that kind of faith in a Gentile man When he heard this, he marveled, verse 9, and turned him about and said to the people that followed him, I say unto you, I have not found so great faith, no, not in Israel. I think it's significant there in verse 9 that Jesus took a minute to turn to the people who were following him and make a point to them. I want to tell you, folks, I got to tell you, that's an amazing statement. That message that he just sent to me, that's really incredible. And so Jesus didn't just say to himself, wow, I'm impressed. He took the time to make that observation to the people who were there. I want to tell you something. This is great faith. I haven't found faith like that, not among the Jews. This guy is a man of great faith. And of course, his request was granted when they that were sent returned to the house. They found the servant whole that had been sick. Notice this sickness that he was healed of was not, he had a migraine, or he had a bad cold, or I don't know, he sprained his ankle or something. It says there in verse 2 that he was sick and ready to die. So this servant was seriously ill at the point of death. And soon as the messengers returned back to the house, and they weren't far from the house at that. Remember it said Jesus wasn't far from the house when these second messengers arrived. And when they returned to the house, he was whole. It didn't say he was getting better, that he had sort of turned the corner and was improving somewhat. So he was made whole. He was 100% healthy. Tom?
If you're being sick or death, you're being in a position, making that statement there, sort of clarifies and puts some emphasis on it, like what we call an authoritative statement that he's going through doing. It's not just Luke arbitrarily saying this. He has the credentials to be able to say that.
Exactly.
And then the other thought was that these Jewish leaders that came weren't your typical Jewish leaders that were always in confrontation with Jesus, trying Jesus. They actually believed that he was doing these things, and when they came to him, they said, this man is worthy.
Good point. The elders believed that Jesus could do it. But now, remember, this is Galilee. This is Capernaum in Galilee. This is not the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem who always hated Jesus.
Yeah, but there were these same ones up in Nazareth. We see.
Yeah.
There were those groups that were there that they wouldn't believe anything that Jesus did, even when they were present when it was done.
Exactly.
They were looking to, protect their situation.
Yeah.
These leaders here, they had that situation where they'd seen Jesus, they heard Jesus. Evidently, they had talked to the centurion about this power. So he selected the ones. He didn't take the ones that he heard negative stuff from. He took the stuff that he heard positive from and sent them to Jesus.
Okay, good point. All right. Let's keep reading here in chapter 7. Luke chapter 7, verse 11. It came to pass the day after that he went into a city called Nain, and many of his disciples went with him, and much people. Now when he came nigh to the gate of the city, behold, there was a dead man carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow, and much people of the city was with her. And when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her, and said unto her, Weep not. And he came and touched the bier, and they that bare him stood still. And he said, Young man, I say unto thee, arise. And he that was dead sat up and began to speak, and he delivered him to his mother. And there came a great fear on all, and they glorified God, saying that this is a great prophet is risen up among us, and that God hath visited his people. And this rumor of him went forth throughout all Judea and throughout all the region round about. Okay, I'm gonna present this to you. This is ridiculous. These people are so ignorant and uneducated and superstitious that they actually believe Jesus raised a dead man here. This guy wasn't dead. He was probably pretty sick and maybe appeared to be near death, and they just assumed he was dead, and they were carrying him out to bury him. Jesus came, and Jesus saw an opportunity to deceive the people, and so Jesus was a little smarter than they were, and he was very cunning and crafty. And was able to recognize this guy is not dead. He's going to come. He's going to wake up here in a minute. And so he used that opportunity to deceive the people. How are you going to answer that? Anybody? Monty?
One thing, people in this time frame were more familiar with death, per se, than we are. Because, I mean, they slaughtered their own animals and prepared them and cooked. We go to the grocery store typically and buy whatever meat we want. Most of us don't butcher our own meat. These people, this time, in our time frame, somebody dies, usually it's in a hospital or a nursing home or something like that, and some medical professional tells us this person is dead. They've done all the checks or whatever necessary to do that, and they confirm that he's dead. These people, typically, they died at home or close by in the community or whatever, so they were familiar. They knew what dead people looked like. They knew the symptoms that they don't have a heartbeat, that they're not breathing. I don't guess they checked for brain function. But I mean, they could tell what body's done when they died. They were familiar with that. So if these people thought the guy was dead, it's practically a guaranteed certain fact. There's no question about it. This guy was dead.
I think that's right. I think that's exactly right. You know, we have the mistaken opinion that we are so much more intellectually elevated and educated, and we know more. These people were foolish, ignorant, and uneducated. It was easy to deceive them. We wouldn't have been so easily deceived. I just think that's a big mistake. I think Monty said it exactly. They knew what a dead man looked like. They knew what death was. They dealt with death on a regular basis. And so they were not mistaken that this guy was dead. You know, but that's how the modernists, of course the modernists are the people who want to explain away all the supernatural miracles of the Bible. And so the modernist wants to have some natural explanation for what happened here, and their explanation would have to be the guy wasn't really dead. He maybe looked pretty dead, but he wasn't actually dead. That's what they'd have to say. But I think Monty's put the hammer right on the nail head. They knew death, and they knew how to judge if a man had died. This guy was dead. Josh.
According to, so verse 12, they were coming near to the gate of the city, which is like the main entryway, and the dead man was being carried out. So it wasn't like this was some secret back dark alley, you know. And then and it says in verse 12 there was much people of the city with her. And then in verse 16 it says fear came on all. And so I mean, even if there was one or two people that said, I don't really think he's dead, then fear would have come upon all. They would have been shouting.
Good point.
No, he's not really dead.
Good point. I think that's a really good point. And the fact that Jesus did these kind of miracles openly and publicly, you know, it wasn't like he was off in some remote place with two of his disciples and they came to town and said, you won't believe what we saw Jesus do yesterday. Jesus raised a man from the dead yesterday. No, Jesus did it in the presence of this crowd of people. They knew. And again, although it doesn't go into a whole lot of detail about the recovery, it says in verse 15, he that was dead sat up and began to speak, and they delivered him to his mother. And so again, if he was near death and Jesus revived him, it's unlikely that he would sit up and speak and act normal, be delivered to his mother. This was obviously a miracle, and the modernist is going to have a hard time explaining that away. Tom?
Interesting. They call it a coffin, but I don't know if really the Jewish practice was a coffin.
The King James calls it a bier, B-I-E-R.
And we know the Jews typically wash and then, prior to burial, wrap.
Yours version says coffin.
Yep.
The King James says bier, which I think probably might be more accurate. They would be carrying him on a platform of some kind on the shoulders of strong men, more than likely. It'd be my guess, because they're going to take him to either a cave or a sepulcher and place him inside. They didn't bury their bodies typically in coffins. I think you're right.
But, I mean, just little things like that. You see that the Jews had a practice of washing prior to burial and things like that. So all that had been done. We go back and see.
So you're right. So not only did they know he was dead, but they had actually prepared the dead body.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly right. Timothy?
know death, but they also had people claiming to be the Messiah pretty often. And so, I mean, it was pretty true that they were going to check. Like, yeah, we're going to make sure that what you're doing is true. Because that was
the
a
skeptics
common
sort of serve as a check and balance here, don't they? If he wasn't dead, some of Jesus' enemies probably would have shouted out, fraud, fake, that guy's not dead. There was no, in fact, instead, as Josh pointed out, everybody was impressed. Verse 16, they glorified God. All, great fear came upon all, and they glorified God. And this rumor of him, that he could even raise the dead, was circulated. You know, it's interesting to me that, and Josh has been doing some efforts to contact a woman in our county that claims to be able to heal people. They're not raising, all these fake healers, they're not raising dead people. You know, if I gotta tell you this, if we could take one of these guys out to the cemetery and they would raise a dead person right out of the grave, I'm gonna tell you, I'm gonna stand back and say, whoa, what about that? You know, and I'd have to rethink everything I believe if they could do that. They can't do that. Right? Wade?
When my dad died, he died about 12:45 in the afternoon, and it was probably, I'd say probably at least 3 or 4 before the funeral home even come and got him. So he was dead for a while before they even brought him out. You wonder how long this guy had stayed there. You know, you typically family has to get there. They had to do some.
The Jews didn't do that. The Jews buried the same day they died because they didn't prepare the body in any way. They didn't embalm the body in any way. They buried him the day they died. Actually, a human body will begin to decompose within about 4 hours. And that's why they buried them the same day, because they weren't embalming. They weren't doing any of that kind of treatment to the body. And so if you even waited till the next day, the body's going to stink. You remember when they came to Lazarus, when Jesus came to raise Lazarus from the dead, he was already in the tomb. And Jesus had rolled the stone back. And I think it was Martha who said, surely by now he stinketh. Because the human body decomposed pretty rapidly.
I think it takes about 6 hours for the workers
Yeah.
to come in.
Yeah. Tom?
I remember when my phone passed away, in the middle of the night, we got a call. We had to drive about an hour and a half to the hospital to pick up my mother-in-law. And I remember going in to the area where he was, and when you touched him, he didn't have that soft touch. He was almost solid, like that. The flexibility and the soft tissue had hardened up.
Rigor mortis. Yeah.
It's just that short amount of time, and it didn't really feel natural. So, you know,
Again,
there's other ways to tell.
There's ways to tell this body's dead.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. Carla.
Luke was a physician, correct?
Right.
And his account here is always brings out the medical details that's coming through. And so if he's making this account that the individual was passed away, that's a good indication because it's his account.
I think you're right. Whenever we're reading the statements of Luke, they can always be kind of amplified by his status as a physician. I think you're right. Dan?
So they only just say dead man. They don't say actually what he died from.
Yeah.
So it's kind of shallow to think that, oh, he just may have died peacefully. We don't know if he died from a horrific accident where he fell off a horse and hit his head on a rock and
That's a
his
good
head
point.
was cracked.
We kind of assume that he got an
Yeah.
illness and he lingered for many days and then he finally died in his sleep. You're exactly. He may have fallen off a roof and impaled himself on a stick. For all we know, we don't know. Good point, Dan. I think that's a good point. Anybody else? All right. So again, powerful miracles done by Jesus to confirm his identity as the Son of God. Now that leads us to this next paragraph in which this question of his identity comes up. So let's begin reading at verse 18. And the disciples of John showed him all these things. What things? Well, in this chapter, he has healed a man sick to the point of death, and he's raised a dead man. I mean, just in the immediate verses that we've just read. So these things are happening in this context. And so when it says the disciples of John showed him all these things, that's got to be what they're talking about, right? And John, calling unto him 2 of his disciples, sent them to Jesus, saying, Art thou he that should come, or look we for another? And when the men were come unto John, they said, John the Baptist hath sent us unto thee, saying, Art thou he that should come, or look we for another? And in the same hour he cured many of their infirmities and plagues, and of evil spirits, and also many that were blind he gave sight. Then John answering said to them, Go your way, and tell John what things ye have seen and heard, how the blind see, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, to the poor the gospel is preached. And blessed is he whosoever shall not be offended in me. All right, so this is a really interesting text here, in my opinion. So the big question is, what about John? Is John's faith uncertain at this point? Is his faith shaken? Now, we know that John had himself been suffering persecution. Go back to chapter 3. In chapter 3, verse 19, Herod the Tetrarch, being reproved by John for Herodias his brother Philip's wife, and for all the evils which Herod had done, added yet this above all, that he shut up John in prison. So John was being persecuted. Obviously, he's the one who was giving out that Jesus is the Messiah. You know, he's the one who has been preparing the way for the Lord. But now things are not going too smoothly, and he's under persecution. Has his faith been shaken? Or, here's the alternative to that. Now, a lot of people take that view, that the faith of John has been shaken. He's not sure Jesus is the one. Here's an alternate view. The alternate view is that Jesus sent these disciples to Jesus for their benefit. Go ask Jesus. Go see what you think. Go ask Jesus, are you the one that's supposed to come, or are we looking for another? And then in the presence of those disciples sent by John, amazing miracles were performed in their presence. I'm going to tell you, I unequivocally take the second view, that that John sent these disciples to Jesus for their benefit. Not that John was having his own faith in question. John's an inspired man, right? You know, in the start of this Gospel of Luke, we read about the birth of John the Baptist. John, in my opinion, there is no way in the world that John could have had any doubt about the identity of Jesus as the only begotten Son of God and the promised Messiah. There's just no doubt about that. I don't see how there could possibly have been any doubt in John's mind. And so I strongly take the view that the reason he sent those disciples was for them. Remember, John had said, he must rise, I must decline. You know, I am not the one, but the one is coming. I'm not worthy to unloosen the shoelaces of his sandals. John didn't have any doubt who Jesus was, but he wanted his. So there's going to have to be a transition, right? Coming up, there's going to have to be a tradition. Those who had identified as the disciples of John are going to have to transition and become disciples of Jesus. And so John, I think John's just aiding that process here. So they come and they ask Jesus, are you the one? John sent us. And we're to ask, are you the one that we're looking for, or are we looking for somebody else? Jesus does not answer the question with words. Instead, he answers the question by performing multiple miracles, significant multiple miracles. And then he says, go tell John what you saw. Not for John's benefit. Go report back to John. And again, I think it was all for the benefit of those disciples. Tom?
Closing statement Jesus uses there. He did all the, he goes to his, he does all the miracles. He tells them the blind see, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the poor have been preached to. That's the message of John. When it comes through, that John says, "Okay, my work is done." Yeah. Jesus is preaching to the poor. That's what
he's got the Gospels going out.
I'm sent to proclaim that he's coming. Here he's doing what he's proclaimed to do. I can face death now.
Yeah, good point. I think that's a good observation. This is probably as good a place as any to show why did Jesus perform miracles? What was the purpose of miracles? To confirm his identity. And so when directly asked about his identity, are you the one that we're looking for, or are we waiting for somebody else? When directly asked that question, he didn't answer with words, he answered with miracles. And so I think this is an excellent place to show what were the miracles for anyway. They were for confirmation of Jesus' identity as the Son of God, in his case. Now, later when people would, for instance, when the apostles and other inspired people of the first century, others who had gifts of the Holy Spirit, when they worked miracles, it was for revealing and confirming the truth. But in the case of Jesus specifically, it was for the purpose of revealing and confirming his identity as the Son of God. Comments or questions here? Anybody? All right, we are just out of time, and that's a really good place to stop for today. And so, Lord willing, we'll pick up our discussion there next Sunday.